President Donald Trump says arrangements are now underway to bring Vladimir Putin and Volodymyr Zelensky together for peace talks.
President Putin agreed that Russia would accept security guarantees for Ukraine, and this is one of the key.
The world is watching closely, and for good reason. Donald Trump has unveiled a peace plan for Ukraine that could change the course of the war, redraw borders, and shift the global balance of power. But here's the question. Is this really a roadmap to peace or just a dangerous compromise dressed up as diplomacy? Where are you watching from today? Drop your location in the comment side. Love to know how people across the globe see this critical turning point. Stay with me until the end, because what we're about to uncover is not just politics. It's history unfolding in real time. Chapter 1. The Peace Pitch. Big promises, big questions. When wars drag on, the idea of peace, no matter how fragile, becomes tempting. That's exactly the stage we're at with Ukraine. After years of brutal fighting, mass displacement, and billions poured into military aid, the conflict remains unresolved. Enter Donald Trump with a proposal that, at least on the surface, looks like a bold attempt to break the stalemate. But beneath the surface, the details reveal something much more complex and controversial. So, what exactly is Trump offering? The plan is built on 7 main points, and its central feature is this. Freeze the war along the current front lines. That means Russia keeps control of Crimea and the territories it seized in for other Ukrainian regions. Ukraine, in exchange, would pledge not to join NATO. In Trump's vision, this concession would stop the fighting and set the stage for negotiations on long-term stability. At first glance, some might say this is pragmatic. It accepts the reality on the ground and avoids further bloodshed. But for Ukraine and many of its supporters, it looks less like peace and more like legitimizing aggression. It rewards the use of force by essentially acknowledging Russia's territorial gains, something Ukraine has resisted since day one. But the plan doesn't stop there. Trump adds economic sweeteners to try and balance the deal. Sanctions on Russia would be lifted, allowing its economy to re-enter global markets. Trade could resume, investment could flow, and Moscow would feel less pressure. The logic is simple. If Russia has something to gain, it may be more willing to stick to the terms. For Ukraine, the offer is more complicated. According to the proposal, Kyiv might regain partial control over Kharkiv, one of the regions devastated by fighting. Ukraine would also be granted rights to navigate the Dnieper River and essential waterway for trade and supply lines. And to address the catastrophic damage from the war, there would be promises of reconstruction aid, funded in part by international partners. Then comes the most unusual element, the Zaporizhzhia nuclear plant. This is Europe's largest nuclear power station and has been under Russian control since the invasion. Trump's plan suggests creating a joint management structure where the United States and international partners would run the facility, generating electricity to supply both Ukraine and Russia. On paper, it sounds like a practical solution, turn a flashpoint into a shared asset. But in reality, it raises massive questions about sovereignty, safety, and trust. This is where many diplomats and analysts raised alarms. The proposal, they argue, is a dangerous precedent. It effectively signals that borders can be changed by military force if the aggressor is powerful enough and if the world is tired of fighting. This undermines one of the bedrock principles of modern international law, the idea that territory cannot be taken by invasion. To put it in perspective, think about the Stimson Doctrine adopted by the United States nearly a century ago. It declared that no territory acquired by force would ever be recognized as legitimate. That principle shaped how the world responded to conflicts for decades. By departing from it, Trump's plan could send ripple effects far beyond Ukraine. Places like Taiwan, Moldova, or even disputed areas in Africa and Asia could all be influenced by this precedent. Let's take a step back and look at the broader strategy here. Trump isn't just talking about peace in Ukraine. He's also signaling a shift in how America might approach foreign policy under his leadership. Rather than sticking to principles like sovereignty and international law, the focus shifts to deal-making. Get the war to stop quickly. Give each side just enough to feel like they've gained something, and then move on. To his supporters, this looks like pragmatic leadership. To his critics, it looks like reckless short-termism that sacrifices long-term stability. Now, let's not forget the human side. For millions of Ukrainians, this isn't an abstract debate. Accepting this deal would mean permanently losing homes, lands, and even entire cities to Russia. Families displaced from Crimea or Donetsk would have no chance of returning. For them, peace would come at the cost of surrendering their identity and their future. Meanwhile, in Russia, such a deal would be portrayed as a triumph. State media would claim it as proof that their invasion was justified and successful. That could embolden further aggression, not just against Ukraine, but in other regions where Russia has influence. If force is rewarded once, why wouldn't it be tried again? At the same time, fatigue is real. Europe and the United States have poured billions into supporting Ukraine. Military aid, humanitarian relief, and refugee assistance have strained budgets. Public opinion, especially in the US, is becoming divided. Some argue that if Trump can bring an end to the war on unfavorable terms, it's better than endless conflict with no clear outcome. This is where the plan touches a nerve. It plays on two powerful emotions: the desire for peace and the fear of escalation. No one wants the war to spiral further, and yet no one wants to legitimize aggression either. That tension is why this proposal has ignited such a fierce debate. Let's also talk about NATO. Under Trump's plan, Ukraine would be permanently barred from joining the alliance. For Kyiv, this is a bitter pill. NATO membership has long been seen as the ultimate security guarantee against Russian aggression. Without it, Ukraine would remain vulnerable, relying only on bilateral promises that may or may not hold up in the future. And what about the global stage? If the US openly endorses a settlement that gives Russia territorial gains, how will Europe respond? Already, several European leaders have warned that such a plan is unacceptable. They insist that borders cannot be redrawn by war. Ignoring those voices could strain the very alliances that have held firm throughout the conflict. So, as we close this first chapter, here's where we stand. Trump's peace plan is bold, disruptive, and deeply controversial. It offers immediate relief, but carries long-term risks. It could stop the fighting tomorrow, but at the price of rewriting the rules of international order. It appeals to those desperate for an end to war, but terrifies those who fear the consequences of rewarding aggression. And this leaves us with a pressing question. Is peace at any price really peace, or just the beginning of a new and more dangerous chapter? Chapter 2. Diplomacy at work, White House chess, and European pushback. When a peace plan is proposed, the battlefield shifts from trenches and artillery to conference tables and press conferences. That's exactly what happened once Trump's Ukraine plan entered the spotlight. August became a month of furious diplomacy, phone calls, flights, late-night strategy sessions, all centered on one question: could this plan actually work? The drama unfolded at the White House. Trump hosted Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky, along with key European leaders, in a series of high-profile meetings. Cameras captured the handshakes, the smiles, and the carefully chosen words of unity. But behind closed doors, the discussions were anything but easy. One of the main topics was security guarantees. If Ukraine agreed to Trump's framework, what protection would it have against future attacks? Trump's team floated the idea of a guarantee similar to NATO's Article 5, where an attack on one is treated as an attack on all. But the details were vague. European countries might commit troops on the ground, while the United States would provide air support, but not soldiers. For Ukraine, this was an uneasy compromise. Zelensky had long argued that NATO membership was the only true safeguard. A half-promise, delivered through a patchwork of bilateral agreements, felt far less reliable. It raised a critical question: what happens if Russia violates the deal? Would Western nations really risk lives to intervene again? As negotiations dragged on, Trump's patience wore thin. He publicly voiced frustration, warning that if progress wasn't made soon, he was prepared to hit both sides with new tariffs or sanctions. It was classic Trump using economic threats to push for political results. His message was clear: agree to the deal or face consequences. But diplomacy doesn't move on a deadline. Russian officials responded slowly, insisting there was no finalized agenda for a Putin-Zelensky summit. They signaled willingness to talk, but avoided committing to any concrete steps. For Moscow, time was on their side. Every delay allowed them to consolidate control over the occupied regions and keep the pressure on Ukraine. Meanwhile, Europe sent a message of its own. Leaders in France, Germany, and Poland made it clear they could not support a settlement that rewarded aggression. In their view, ceding territory to Russia would be disastrous not only for Ukraine, but for the entire international system. They argued that allowing Russia to keep land seized by force would send a signal to other powers that might be tempted to do the same. Borders would no longer be secure. Small countries everywhere would live in fear that a stronger neighbor could redraw maps at will. This wasn't just theory. European officials pointed to Moldova, which has long worried about Russian influence in its breakaway region of Transnistria. They also mentioned Taiwan, where China is closely watching how the West responds to Ukraine. To them, Trump's plan wasn't just about ending one war, it was about setting the rules for future conflicts. For President Zelensky, the pressure was immense. On one side, he faced a superpower demanding concessions. On the other, he had allies urging him not to compromise. At home, millions of Ukrainians remained steadfast in their refusal to accept the loss of Crimea or Donbass. For them, these weren't bargaining chips. They were part of their homeland. Accepting Trump's plan would mean telling those people they could never go home. It would mean acknowledging that the sacrifices of soldiers and civilians were, in some sense, for nothing. That's why Zelensky resisted, even as the prospect of continued war weighed heavily on him. Across the table, Vladimir Putin played a different game. For him, the plan was both a victory and a risk. On one hand, it would cement Russia's control of Crimea and other territories, something he could present as a triumph to his people. On the other hand, agreeing too quickly might expose him to criticism from hardliners who believe Russia should take even more. So, the Kremlin stalled. They welcomed the idea of negotiations, but insisted the details weren't ready. By dragging their feet, they forced the West to keep arguing among themselves, while Russia continued to benefit from its battlefield position. What we see here is diplomacy as chess. Every move is calculated, every word chosen for maximum leverage. Trump wants to prove he can deliver results where others failed. Europe wants to defend principles of sovereignty and law. Ukraine wants survival without betrayal. And Russia wants recognition without giving up its ambitions. The result: deadlock. The White House meetings produced headlines, but not agreements. Trump threatened deadlines, but they came and went. Europe held firm on refusing to endorse territorial concessions. And Russia kept its cards close to its chest. Why does this matter so much? Because the consequences extend far beyond Ukraine. If Trump's plan succeeds, it will reshape the rules of diplomacy. If it fails, it could deepen divisions among Western allies and embolden Russia to press even harder. For the United States, the risk is credibility. If Washington appears willing to compromise on Ukraine's borders, allies in Europe and Asia may question whether America would defend them in a crisis. For Europe, the risk is survival. A weak deal could leave them facing a stronger, more confident Russia just a few hundred miles from their capitals. And for Ukraine, the stakes are existential. This isn't just about land, it's about identity, sovereignty, and the right to decide their own future. So, here's where things stand. Trump's plan sparked diplomacy at the highest levels, but has yet to produce real progress. Ukraine remains skeptical, Europe remains resistant, and Russia remains evasive. What began as a bold attempt to freeze the war has become a test of wills between global powers. The question now is whether this peace plan is truly a step toward ending the conflict or just the start of a deeper struggle over the principles that govern our world. And that brings us back to you. Do you think compromise is necessary to end the war, even if it means redrawing borders? Or should peace never come at the cost of giving in to aggression?